Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Distorted Podcast. Today, I'm once again joined by Ashley Kelly, my friend, a mom, a business owner, all those wonderful things. She's very intelligent, and she's a lot of fun to talk to, so I like bringing her back. Today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to touch on some parental issues, raising a family through the Christian lens, through a faith-based lens, and sort of the difficulty of that, the competition that comes up because of the world the way that it is, and maybe just some of the struggles, not all of them, but some of them. And then we're going to try to tie that into some of the reasoning as to why that might be difficult, and an outlook as to how to navigate it better. So I'm going to let Ashley start us off by just talking a little bit about the nature of, raising children with a faith-based premise in mind, because that's the belief that we have. And maybe starting off with, why that at times can be stressful and difficult. And then we'll just kind of take it from there.
Okay, yes. Well, I can definitely say having 4 kids and trying to raise them in a way where they know God's love and share God's love with others isn't always easy. And it can really feel hard at times because, as George Barna has highlighted in his research, we have a culture where media is the number one influencer on children, and children are spending more time with media than they are at church, with their parents, in school, and it's all consuming. So we really do feel like we are competing with the messages that they're getting across the board. And now more than ever, the role that we play as parents in reinforcing the values that we want to reinforce at home is that much more important. And it can feel really overwhelming. And I know for me and a lot of other moms that I'm friends with, it's also, there's a lot of distortions around parenting because we feel like we're failing. We feel like we're not enough. We feel like we have to do it alone. And all of those distortions can really get in the way of us being able to parent and to enjoy this stage of life that we're in. I always hear older parents tell me that have adult children, oh, these are the days, these are the moments, enjoy them. And sometimes I get frustrated with that because it's hard to enjoy it all the time, right? Mm-hmm. We're stressed out, we're tired, we feel like we're not enough, we feel like we don't have enough hands, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough going on. And I think that one of the biggest ways that we can enjoy it and take that advice is by changing our mental distortions and flipping them and coming to a point where, yes, there is a lot to do, but I'm so thankful I get to do it. Right. And so the mind switch and all the different daily activities that we're doing for our kids has been really powerful for me. I can feel very alone, or I can say I'm so thankful that I have a community around me that is also pouring into my kids. I have an incredible husband that is my partner in this. My mom didn't have that. She raised me as a single mom. And then there's also incredible single mothers out there probably listening to this. And you're not alone either, because you have the Lord guiding you, directing you. You have a church community, you have friends. And I think that these distortions that we tell ourselves as parents can really limit us from being able to truly enjoy this stage of parenting. And for me, that has been the biggest challenge within myself, is to flip that switch and to make sure that when I step on a toy and it hurts my foot, instead of getting frustrated that they didn't clean up, I'm so grateful that there's a toy to step on, because there was a time when I didn't have toys to step on and the house was empty and quiet. And so I think there are so many ways, and that's just one little example, that we can can flip those distortions, change those lies that we're telling ourselves, and truly come to a time of peace so that we can raise our kids with love, with God's love, and spend that time with them that we need to spend with them because they're getting influenced in so many other ways.
I think the example is such a sweet example, but it's such a practical, like real life example of that's not a fun thing to have that happen. But at the same time, I want to speak to where I think that can come from. I think that, and I've used this before, but the PIES acronym of physical, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, it goes from surface to depth. Spirituality being the depth of our being and the most infiltrated. It's got the most tentacles, if you will, to build us from the inside out, to create resiliency. Even in the example you gave, in that little simple example, and when you said that, when you said toy, I pictured Lego. So you have the sharp-edged Lego,
and if you've ever stepped on a Lego, it does not feel good.
And so, yeah, but just the idea that it sort of strikes home to me. The normal response would be to feel the pain and to be put off by that pain. And the remarkable nature of saturating yourself in your faith, and not just in your faith, but also the other ways of taking care of yourself, to understand that as a mom or dad, that you're pivotal to the raising of the children. And you touched on the other things we're going to talk about, the competition that exists in what everything else out there in the world is promoting, that the resilience that we have by taking care of ourselves, spirituality being at the core of it, is that we're committed to our relationship with God. We're in communion with Him. You said it, we're not alone. Some people feel that way. I get that. We're not being Pollyanna about it. We're saying that the investment in that carries over in your ability to stay focused on what's important to you. So you're teaching your children that. And then the recourse is that the children have that reflective ability. They have the mirroring aspect because they're watching you be resilient, even though it's difficult. And one other thing that you mentioned that I thought was important. You are in the middle of raising children, and that's not easy in and of itself. The very act of the most beautiful thing you can do, which is parenting, motherhood, not to forget the fathers, but motherhood. And the idea that while you're doing that very beautiful thing, it's still stressful. It's still difficult.
Right.
And so the self-care you do directly relates to your ability to have this mindset that you spoke of, to challenge the distortion that the difficulty is not being blessed by the joy of what you're actually doing, that you are interacting with children, or that you're communally sharing that the weight of that with other people. So we don't want to be lost on the struggle part, but we want to recognize that within the struggle, there's also a lot of beauty.
I think that's kind of what you were saying.
Definitely. I think that we can focus on the struggle and get lost in the struggle. And yes, it is there. It is real. It is legitimate. You are validated in that. It is hard. And it is not easy, like you said, to parent. If you are a good parent, it is not easy, right? If you think it's easy to be a parent, maybe you need to reevaluate what you're doing, because parenting is not easy, and it shouldn't be easy because you are raising the next generation, and there is nothing more important than that, right? So if you feel that heaviness of, wow, I have this responsibility, then that's not easy. But it's amazing at the same time, and it's incredible, and there's so much purpose and life in it. And that outweighs the hard, in my opinion, right? And if we can focus on that mentally, then we will feel better, right? It's this idea of how our thoughts impact our feelings and our behavior, which is what we always talk about. when we work with clients and when we're really trying to change how we feel. If you want to change how you feel as a parent, you have to change how you think about being a parent. And I think that that is a simple way to start enjoying your children more, to start enjoying your family more and your role more. And also, like you said, the self-care piece, which is making sure that you're identifying what areas that you need to pour into yourself so that you can pour into your kids. They always use that analogy of you can't pour an empty cup into another cup, right? The cup has to be filled in order for you to pour into an empty cup. And so as a parent, we do need to make sure that we are implementing self-care. And it's not going to look the same as it did before you had kids, and that's okay. But it could just be 10 minutes a day for yourself, whatever that looks like. It could be an hour, it could be longer, but at least it's something, and it's a way for you to make sure that you are taking a minute for yourself and focusing on you so that you can pour into your kids. So I think there's a lot of good stuff in what you said, Lenny, because as parents, we want to be everything we can for our children, and we aren't going to be perfect. And that is one of the other distortions, is you think that you have to do it all for your children and you have to be that perfect parent. But we know there's only one perfect parent, and that's our Heavenly Father, and we are not going to be that. And so making sure that we, again, change the switch of, okay, I'm not perfect, so I need to apologize to my child for how I talk to them, or I need to take a step back and see where I can improve as well. And so but at the same time, not constantly being hard on ourselves of, I failed here, I did this wrong. And then we can get stuck in that. And we don't want to get stuck in that.
We don't want to get stuck in that, and I think it's okay to receive help. I mean, I think that's one of the ideas that we talk about with, if we're not doing everything and if we're not good enough at it, and we start to turn that into, I'm doing something wrong, as opposed to, wait a minute, let's normalize that. Everybody needs help. Everybody needs help, and everybody needs support. So when there's times, if there's other caretaking people that are in the environment, that's a good thing. That doesn't mean that you're weak. That doesn't mean that you failed. It means that you have to refuel. And in order to do that, sometimes you have to trust that there's other, components around you that are going to be supportive of the same ideal, the same goal. And it's not a bad thing. It's not bad to do that. It's not bad to have the support that you need. I'll give a great example would be, the children are old enough to go to school, or they're old enough to engage in maybe a sport activity. You're counting on that to be productive for them, an organizing of, playing a team sport, or they're involved in music. And, when the child is learning something outside of your scope, that you have time for restoration, during that. And I think that there's, a balance to this. I want to bring in another component too, that there's a natural progression that takes place while raising children, regardless of time frame. You're talking about little children, or you're talking about pre-adolescent or adolescent, that there's things that are happening within the child's development that sometimes are cohesive to the style of parenting and promoting, the faith-based lens that you have for your children, the thing that you want them to understand, that God is above it all. And the normal development that takes place that can cause a child to be influenced, even though you're doing all those things, that it's not a failure, that there is a balance to this idea that the consistency of how you parent, I think, would be just as important as the involvement, because, again, your resiliency comes from you taking care of yourself. Then you pour into your children, right? The one example I've given to people before is a lot of times when I have women come in to see me and they're exhausted or they're overwhelmed, I'll use a basket analogy to basically say, you have a basket that you carry with you, and in that basket you put things in it, and you are the type of person who likes to share what you have. And you think of yourself as a woman of service, and you start to share what's in the basket. And you eventually get to a place where you've given away all the items in the basket. And it's very important at that moment to recognize that if you give away your basket, you run out of resource. And the encouragement is replenish the items that you'd put in the basket. Essentially, the analogy is replenish yourself so you can continue to give of your resource. I think that that's important. We forget sometimes as mothers and fathers that ultimately it's not selfish to take care of yourself, because that's what you're going to use as the conduit, right? As the conduit to pour into your children. Let me say one more thing about that, and then I'll put it back to you to make sense out of this, because the developmental thing with dependency, when the children are 0 to 12, they are completely dependent on decision making and authority through the parental lens. You have the most influence, let's say, and you are raising them the way that you think they should be raised, which is absolutely, you're right. And through 0 through 12, you have the effectiveness of their biology and their mental structure and their social structure and their psychological structure. All that stuff is all in line with that. And then something happens. Then it gets complicated, because then they enter into a phase where they start expanding their own understanding of what that is, and they start to do peer review, and they start to look at other people who are relative to them, that look the same as them, that are in the same groups as them. And then they start doing a comparison. They start saying, hey, this is what mom and dad said, but this is what my friends are doing, and this is the kind of feedback I get from them. And the reason I point this out, because obviously we could talk about parenting from any perspective. So I want to kind of narrow in on this perspective that's, I think, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong on this one, I think that's the moment when the competition takes place, when you start to see the resistance or the difference in how the child responds to you. Now, you're hoping that whatever you instilled in them is still the dominant voice. And I would say in most cases it is. But now we start to see the trickle in of other influence. And maybe let's sit there for a minute and unpack this a little bit. What's your take on that influence that starts to take place during those years?
Well, I haven't gotten to that stage in parenting myself, but I can speak from even my own experience in those years of life, as well as what I've observed with others and people that we've worked with. Yeah. Yes. So I think that it is really important to allow your kids, one, to make mistakes and to have a safe place to deal with those mistakes. And also, we talked about in another episode, boundaries, right? Boundaries are really important, especially in that stage of parenting, I would imagine, because this is a time when you're going to get the most resistance from your children on those boundaries. But your job is still to protect them. They still under your roof. I remember my mom, I was a really good kid and I was a really good teenager, and I wanted to have more freedom. And she was really strict compared to my peers' parents. And one of her good friends pulled her aside and said, listen, Chris, she is a good kid. Give her some freedom. And so from that moment on, my mom did give me a lot more freedom, but she told me, she said, listen, if you break my trust, you're going back to all of those restrictions. And so I worked my tail off to make sure that I wasn't going to break her trust, because I knew what it was like before to have those restrictions. And then I have this sense of freedom. And so for me, and that's me, my personality, I'm more of a rule follower. I'm more of that. I was just on that path anyway. So I think it's going to be per child. But I think that it's important to encourage your kids in good, healthy environments. So one thing that my mom did was she always drove me to youth group. She always, even though she was a single mom, worked full time, she always made a way. If she could say yes to friends coming over and she knew they were good kids, she would always allow me to have them over. And so she was creating these safe spaces for me to have my independence, to build other relationships relationships, to be influenced by my peers, because she knew these were good groups of kids to be around who had good families. So I think it's important to encourage your kids to be social, to be in sports, to be in healthy environments where they are able to get that independence to experience and build those relationships and to be influenced, but also they're in environments that are good environments, and encouraging that, because they are craving that and we want them to have that. We just want it to be in environments that are good, and they may make mistakes, and they're going to have the consequences of those mistakes. And I think that's really, really hard as a parent, because we can't control everything that they do. But that's even now. I have a 6-year-old and down, and I can't control my children as much as I would love to help them make the right choices all the time. They don't, and they won't. And so hopefully they're able to make mistakes in a safe way and in a safe environment and learn from those mistakes. And they don't make really big mistakes that have the life-altering impact, right? Because hopefully because of what we're teaching them in the environments that they're in, and then they won't get to that point. But this
speaks
hard.
That speaks to the idea, though, that you have to have energy enough to do all this. You have to be continuously reminding yourself that feeding yourself, maintaining your connections and your relationships with God and with yourself emotionally, intellectually, physically, that you're maintaining the space that's required in order to put the energy out. Because, again, like you said, this is a cat and mouse type of situation where the biological systems that are in these children are designed to have them branch out. That's just normal creation. They start branching out. They start testing the waters, if you will. And in that place, in order for you to sort of stay in track with them, you have to have energy to do that. So it's a different type of challenge.
And you have to have your own identity. I see a lot where moms, their identity is in their children. And then when their children start to get more independent, they struggle with, well, who am I now? My kids don't need me in the same way. I don't have to tend to them every 10 seconds. They're not with me 24/7. They have their own life. And that can be a really hard transition for especially women, because maybe they don't have a job that they're going 9 to 5 and they've been a full-time stay-at-home mom, and now their kids need them in different ways. So finding time to figure out, what is it that I like to do? Where can I add value to others? What can I do to give back to society if I have more time to do that now? So, and going back a little bit, you also mentioned a really good point earlier about how taking care of ourselves and how building that village and that community of people to do it. And it looks different for everyone, right? I have 4 kids. I have resources that probably a lot of other people don't have, and I'm really grateful for that. But I'm able to hire someone to help with laundry, with meal prep, with cooking, with things that were taking me a lot of time that I wouldn't even be able to get to folding my laundry. It would be clean, but it would be in bins and it would be labeled, and we would just figure out where our clean clothes were, because that was where I was at with 4 kids, 5 and under. Now I have someone that's able to help and to put our clothes away, and we have all of our clean clothes and everything is good to go. And not everyone can do that. But my point is that it's okay. It's okay if you can have those resources, that basket, whatever your basket looks like. Be grateful for it and utilize it, and find ways to add to your resources. And so for my mom, she wouldn't have been able to afford to have someone come and clean her house and do her laundry, but she had people picking me up from school, friends of hers or her parents. I was at my grandparents' house a lot. They were a big help to her. She needed help because she worked from 8 to 6 and I had school. I get done with school and she had a community of people coming alongside of her and helping her take care of me between those hours. And that's okay. And so I think we have to realize and look at what are the resources available to us so we can be more intentional with our kids. And for me, I wanted to be able to sit down and read with my kids when they got home from school and play with them and do magnet tiles with them and do activities with them instead of cleaning and doing laundry and trying to rush around and do everything. And that was a blessing that we could do that. So it's looking at your life and finding ways that if you can add in resources, don't feel guilty to do that so you can take care of yourself and pour into your kids. If you don't have those same resources, you find other ways like I did. I was just throwing my clean clothes in bins and that was okay. I was not going to stress myself out about making sure the clothes are put away.
The balance is to be able to invest because you're competing with alternative voices or other voices that are going to inevitably come into the parenting sphere. So the ultimate thing is that whatever it looks like, there's investment that takes place in order to compete with what inevitably is going to happen. That the older the child gets, parenting takes on a different aspect because there's influences that cannot be controlled and are going to come into the curriculum that the child receives, whether it's school or, because some people homeschool, but whether it's school or an athletic activity or church, let's not forget there's influence there too. But all of the things that come in are then balanced by what it is that the parents are also offering. And to offer those things, it requires a certain sense of awareness of, in order for me to fill, in order for me to feed, there has to be some place to pull that energy from. And again, this is something there's so many different ways to tackle this issue. We're simply saying that in this particular example, that it starts with you as a person. You were a person before you were a parent. And you're pouring into yourself so you can pour into your children because you are inevitably going to be competing with other influences besides the one that you first developed when they were young. And as they get older, that becomes more difficult. And so then we get to the last stage of this where the child hits the point where they're no longer a child. They become what we would call an adult child. And I often used to tell people, we never say child adult unless there's something going on. But we have the term adult child because the premise is that now that they've reached the age of ascension, legally, socially, those come from the outside in. And then the three internals, which is the social, the psychological, the spiritual, and the social, your once child is now separate from the guardianship model. They have taken that plus the peer review to create their own version of what they're going to look like. Now they still look like your kid because they're 18. They probably still look like your baby, but their brain, their biology, and the systems that are in place are going to start supporting them as an independent. And so now the balance becomes a little bit different. And before we started filming, you were talking about, how we can sort of forgive ourselves in this using the example of God and his children. And I'm going to let you talk about that. But this is the staging that happens for most parents, is that sometimes, like you said, they're so invested in an unhealthy way that they're not taking care of self, which in turn pours into the children. They're doing the other version of that where their children becoming independent destroys them almost because they've lost that responsibility and they try to hold on to that responsibility and they get rejection because the child is no longer the child, they're an adult child. And the resistance isn't coming from disrespect. The resistance is coming from a natural progression, right? So then there's that. So I'll let you kind of, because I like the concept that you brought in about sort of bringing in the forgiveness of parenting that doesn't actually go smoothly and having that be biblically reinforced by the thing that you had told me about.
Yes. In Proverbs, it says, raise up a child in the way that they should go and they will not depart. And I know a lot of parents who hold on to that verse, and it is a really good, wonderful verse, and it is a prayer that I have for my children. At the same time, I've also heard how you can interpret it differently, that it's not a promise, it's not a command, right? But it is a hope and it is a proverb. And so there are kids that turn away from God or that don't know the Lord, even though they were raised in a home that of parents who loved them and loved God and trained them in that way. And it's really hard for us to understand that and to rationalize that. And I think the ultimate hope is that one day they will come back and they will not depart from it. And it will be something that they do come back to down the road. And that is the hope, right? At the same time, there is grace for those parents, there is forgiveness for those parents, and there is hope for those parents. Because one of my friends said to me, because I really do try very hard to instill into my kids God's love, and I don't do that perfectly, and it can be hard because I can feel like I'm failing as a parent. And she said to me, her counselor gave her some really good advice and said, listen, you aren't a perfect parent, right? No one is. And if you think about it, God's children disobeyed him. The Israelites disobeyed him. They were wandering in the wilderness for a very long time because of their disobedience. And yet he is the perfect parent. Yeah. So just because our kids are making bad choices, it doesn't necessarily mean it's because we are imperfect parents. They're going to make their own choices. And yes, there are mistakes that we've made along the way, and I'm sure they have impacted our children, and we do need to take ownership for our part in that. At the same time, they are going to make mistakes, and they are going to make their own choices, and that can be really, really hard as a parent to accept.
You're creating a platform for consistency, which is, like I say, the best you can do because there is no perfect. So you're creating consistency in the way that you teach them and guide them. And then you have this competition that not only comes from outside resource, but just the natural development that a child goes through. And so, again, we have to be realistic about this part of it, is that it's the same reason why somebody who wasn't raised in faith can come to faith. It's the same logic that someone who is raised in faith can turn their head, turn their back on it, not because it's no longer present, but because the systems that are in place, some of them God designed, some of them influenced by outside, can cause a confusion, right? Can cause confusion in people. And again, we have plenty of references scripturally to reinforce that you can be confused very easily by messaging that's coming from outside dialogue, right? They always use the enemy is multilingual, whereas God is monolingual. He tells the truth, and so it's easy to be deceived by any number of things. And the more it gets pushed and the more it gets encouraged, the easier it is to be deceived by it. And so I think as parents are going through this, for the ones that I'm trying to speak to now, is to say that you are not the only variable. You're a very significant one, but the idea that a child can make a mistake but still come around, the idea that you're going to do the best you can, and that's really good place to start. That you can step on a Lego, but recognize that without the environment that you've been able to create under God, you wouldn't have a Lego to step on. It's such a wonderful, simplistic way to translate this idea that we're trying to put out there today, is that with the difficulty comes the beauty, and with the struggle and the suffering comes the hope. And it's very hard sometimes to remember there's another side to this, and that your child, somebody out there right now who's listening, who's got a 16-year-old who's struggling with faith or doesn't want it, and is saying things that are hurtful and is saying things that are pushing back against the parents, and the parents are suffering because of that the consistency of how you present yourself is powerful, and that the child making that mistake or the child that's hurting needs love, not anger. And just like, you step on the Lego brick, it's upsetting, but you don't want that upsettedness to turn into something that actually gets projected onto the child who was playing with the toy, right? I think that's kind of so I look at all this and I say, one of the things I always think about is, when Moses was coming down the mountain and he had just been given the commandments, and he got down. I just remember the Charlton Heston movie, and they're violating like 7 out of 10 by the time he even gets down the mountain. And it just puts it in perspective. It's like so. It's almost like, again, he's the father figure, and they're the children, and the children, within a short period of time, have violated themselves on so many different levels. But there's still value in them, and there's still love to be poured upon them, along with the righteousness of being upset. And I think that's the balance, right? So what I hope people can get from this is that the struggle of parenting comes with it also the joy of seeing the children grow and prosper, and recognizing that what you do, as beautiful as that is, it's not the only variable. Trying to give you a new way of looking at this so you don't feel totally responsible, because there are things that are not in your control, which is why we lean on our faith. We lean on God to be the purveyor of what the outcome is going to be. And I think I'll let you kind of maybe piggyback on that God, leaning on your faith, is the thing that gives you strength enough to watch someone you love suffer, but understand that you still have a role in that. You still have a part to play. It just doesn't, once they get older, you're not the only factor anymore.
I think that's kind of what I'm saying.
Yeah. And, you're not the only factor even when they're younger. And there's so many influences over them. And I think that it's really hard as a parent to not feel the pressure that you are the only hope for your child. But in reality, God is the only hope for your child, because even we are imperfect. And I always joke that one day my kids will be in counseling talking about the things that they didn't like that I did, right? Because no matter how hard I try, I'm not going to do it perfectly. It doesn't mean that I shouldn't work on myself and I shouldn't strive to be the best parent that I can be, and I do. But, it's always sweet when my kids tell me, "You're the best mom ever." And it's cute because my son will go, "Not better than God, but you're still the best." Well, thank you. Yes, you're not better than God. You're right.
I think that's a great place to end it, isn't it? That's sort of what we're saying, is that if he holds on to that, which we can't see the future, but our consistency of allowing him to have that probably will fuel the idea that he's going to have that. So I think that's a great way to sort of encapsulate this. For everybody out there, obviously, we don't think that this is the end all. We haven't covered everything. We were just trying to touch on one part of this. If you have questions or you have comments and you'd like something else to be unpacked, we're happy to do that. Thank you so much for the time that you've given us today and listening. Follow if you can follow, subscribe. Thanks to Ashley for her insight and time with me. And thanks to all of you. We'll see you on the next one.
Thank you.